Emil Mathys was this French car dealer who started making his own cars back in 1910. He was based in Strasbourg, which, fun fact, was German territory at the time. His cars were starting to take off just before World War I hit, but when the war started, Emil got drafted into the German army. And since he knew a ton about cars, they sent him to Switzerland to buy trucks. But here's the wild part. They gave him a ton of money for the job, and he just used it as a chance to desert. He kept the cash, bailed on the German army, and waited it out. Once the war was over and Germany lost, Emil went right back to Strasbourg, which was now French territory, and got his car company up and running again. Back in 1937, Mathys decided to branch out and start designing aircraft engines. They set up a new division called Société Mathis Aviation, with offices in Paris and factories in Strasbourg and Gennevilliers. They basically used the same spots as their car businesses, but now Strasbourg handled the cars while Gennevilliers focused on the aircraft engines. A guy named Raymond Georges was in charge of the aircraft engine stuff, and their first big project was a wildly ambitious engine called the Vega. The Vega story kicks off in 1935 when the French Air Ministry wanted a super high-powered aircraft engine, but with some strict size limits on the cylinders. Mathys came up with the Vega, which was this 42-cylinder inline radial beast of an engine. It had 7 banks of 6 cylinders each, all liquid-cooled. They built the cylinder banks out of aluminum with screwed-in steel barrels, and every cylinder had one intake valve and a sodium-cooled exhaust valve. It had a single overhead camshaft per bank to run the valves, powered by the front of the engine. Each cylinder had 2 spark plugs for good measure, and the crankcase was aluminum. Up front, the engine had a planetary gear reduction system that slowed the propeller shaft down to about 42% of the crankshaft speed. At the back, it had a supercharger that spun at over 5 times the crankshaft speed. Fuel was fed through the 2-barrel downdraft carburetor, which was then sent to the air-fuel mix into the supercharger. From there, 7 intake manifolds handled the delivery to the left side of each cylinder bank, and on the right side, you had individual exhaust stacks. To keep the whole thing from overheating, there was a water pump mounted to the back of the supercharger housing with 7 outlets, 1 for each cylinder bank. The Vega had a 4.92-inch bore and a 4.53-inch stroke, which gave this crazy 42-cylinder engine 3,617 cubic inches of displacement, with a compression ratio of 6.5. The whole thing was 42 inches wide and almost 60 inches long. Big, but not ridiculous for what it was packing. The French Air Ministry was absolutely hyped about it and threw money at its development, funding 2 prototypes. The first one was called the 42A, which fired up for the first time in 1938. It cranked out 2,300 horsepower at 3,000 RPM, and it could hit 3,000 horsepower at 3,500 RPM. It weighed about 2,756 pounds, which was definitely not light. Supposedly, 2 prototypes and a full-scale model were built, and some sources say the engine got about 100 hours of testing in a testbed in 1939. But here's the thing, nobody really knows much about the testing or even which plane they slapped this into. It's all still a bit of a mystery. So the 42B version of the Vega was getting some upgrades when the Germans rolled in during May of 1940. The whole Vega engine project had to be packed up and hidden away in the Pyrenees Mountains for safekeeping during the war. Emil, probably thinking the Germans still held a grudge from World War I when he bailed with their cash, didn't stick around and bolted to the United States in late 1940. Once in the United States, Emil got to work. In 1941, he started the Madam Corporation in New York, cranking out ammunition for the Navy. Then, in 1942, he pitched the Vega engine to the U.S. Army Air Force. He told them he had the blueprints and that the prototype was stashed in Lyon, France. He even suggested an unsupercharged version could be used on speedboats for the Navy, but the Air Force wasn't buying it. They figured getting the engine or parts out of France was a logistical nightmare, and besides, they already had mass production rolling on other engines. Plus, converting the Vega to US measurements and setting up production was way too much work for their liking. After the war, Emil headed back to France and picked up where he left off with the Vega. They tweaked the 42 Bravo and called it the 42 Echo. Honestly, it seems like they were pretty much the same engine, but marketing, I guess. They even showed one off in Paris in 1945. The Vega 42 Echo could pump out 2,800 horsepower at 3,200 RPM with a boost of 8.5 psi for takeoff. At 3,000 RPM at 6,562 feet, it was rated at 2,300 horsepower, and it still delivered 1,007 horsepower at 13.1 thousand feet. Not bad for an engine that weighed only 2,600 pounds. Meanwhile, back in 1942, they started working on an even bigger version of the Vega. They initially called it the 42 Delta, but later renamed it the Vesta. This thing was a monster, 42 cylinders, a 2-speed supercharger that could spin up to 5.7 times the crankshaft speed, and direct fuel injection. It had a 6.22-inch bore, 5.71-inch stroke, and a mind-blowing 7,287 cubic inches of displacement. For takeoff, the Vesta was rated at 5,000 horsepower at 2,800 RPM with the same 8.5 psi boost, and its normal rating was over 4,000 horsepower. It was massive, 52 inches in diameter, and tipped the scales at 4,519 pounds. It was overkill, but it was impressive. So like a lot of big engines for the end of World War II, the Vega didn't end up going anywhere, and the Vesta never really was even built. After all that, Mathis shifted focus to smaller air-cooled engines for general aviation. These were designed during the war, and they tried to make as many parts as possible interchangeable, which was a super practical move. A lot of the materials they used came from liberated German scrap, stuff that was originally meant for their projects. But even those smaller engines didn't really take off. They made a few, but production stopped in the early 50s. And as for any surviving Vega engines today, according to official record, not a single engine survives.